Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to introduce our first speaker of the morning, Max from Travel Tech Con.
Thank you, guys. Can you hear me in the back? Perfect. Can you please change the slide? That's what you mean. Yes. Thank you. Welcome everyone here. It's great to see everyone here, and I guess more people will be showing up. We have about 200 people registered, which is great. We're excited about that. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about what we do at Travel Tech Con, why we do it, and what our plans are for the future. And Marina, of course, will be talking about our future in the evening tonight as well. And first of all, thank you once again for everyone to be here. Thank you for our speakers that are here. And thank you for our team and the video crew and the DJs and the venue to organize everything. You know, this is amazing. This is probably the first event that we do at this scale. So this is very exciting. A while ago, I wrote this article. We wanted flying cars. Not that long ago, and where I explain why we do Travel Tech Con. I've been in the travel industry for a few years, and I know that a lot of you have been in the travel industry for much longer. So bear with me. I have an outsider perspective, I would say, on what we do, and I went to my fair share of travel trade shows and travel conferences, and there's a number that you can go to. There are many. But what I lacked as a software engineer, as I am, what I lacked there is different perspective. A lot of people come to those conferences and they talk every time, and if you go to the next big travel conference, they'll be talking about, oh, let's talk about how technology will change travel. Of course it will change travel. Inevitably, it will change travel. Technology is changing the world everywhere, all the industries. And so with this conference, we want to change the perspective a little bit. Let's stop talking about how technology will change travel, because we know it will. Robert Lee yesterday, he was saying that, I mentioned once in my article, in one of my articles, is that every travel company in the next several years will have to become a software company. But Robert Lee, he went even further. He said every travel company and every software company will have to be an AI company in the future, which I definitely believe. So there is no question that technology will change that. There is no question that AI will change travel, or VR will change travel, or blockchain will change travel. We'll just have to accept that change. And therefore, for the first time, as far as I know, and correct me if I'm wrong, this is the first event where that we specifically organize for travel startups, as I think, and we think, the main driver for innovation. People that actually take all those new technologies that big and old companies cannot quite experiment with, or they do it very slowly, and try and build products using those technologies, right? So startups, of course, is one part of the conference that we're organizing, and the other part is developers. And that's also the first event in the travel industry that's designed for developers that work on all sorts of travel problems. And that's exactly what we were lacking when I go to that conference. I would like to talk about all those problems with APIs and integrations, and how do you build a chatbot. There was an amazing presentation about that yesterday, and there will be another talk about AI today. So let's actually try and build those things. Let's try and test them. And we have to accept the change. So again, in my articles about flying cars, I'm talking about the future where we could be. A lot of people, as you know, you've probably heard that phrase. A lot of people are saying that travel is X number of years behind. And I've heard it too many times. And it's true. We experience that ourselves with the companies that I'm working on, how outdated travel tech can be. And our motto, our goal for this conference is to enable collaboration between all kinds of different stakeholders. It's not just about big companies. It's not just about established companies. It's also about travel startups. It's also about individual developers. We all have to get together and talk about all those problems and try and fix them. this is how we think it's going to work. And that's precisely why we're organizing TravelTechCon. Over the past few months, our vision was kind of changing, and there were a lot of many exciting developments with TravelTechCon, such as we organized events for the first time in Buenos Aires and Barcelona, and a lot of people reached out to us from all those international communities that want to work with us. And as you know, you may or may not know that we're running TravelTechCon as a nonprofit. It's not an incorporated nonprofit company, but we're reinvesting all the proceeds from all these events that we're organizing, meetups and conferences, back into all these events. So by attending these events, you're supporting this community that's growing all the time. And again, thank you for your support. And I know that a lot of people today, at least 30%, at least on the first day I asked how many people are not from the United States, and at least 30% of people were from somewhere else. People from Australia, people from Bulgaria, Czech Republic, and Latin America, and it's exciting. And guys, let's organize those communities there as well. So how do we get to that future with flying cars? Where could we be if we didn't have all those problems and barriers in the travel today? Which is, by the way, that's why travel is exciting for me, because there are so many problems. It means that there's a lot of opportunities out there. And I know that we're going to hear many interesting opinions today about travel, its problems, and opportunities as well. So how do we get to that future with flying cars? What do we do? First of all, again, this is the first event for software developers, and that's, I think, how we can advance the technology. Software developers should be getting together on a regular basis and talk about all those problems, and that's what we didn't have before. And we all those different stakeholders should be getting on a regular basis in maybe one room like this one, or maybe online, maybe organizing events all over the world like this one, or maybe being in some sort of online community, which, by the way, we do have. We maybe are not doing a really good job promoting it yet, but we'll up our game, I promise. So that's our vision. That's how we advance, and that's precisely why we're organizing these events. And I'm really excited to have all of you here, and I would like to finish my talk by just saying, let's just get to that future with flying cars as soon as possible. We don't have a lot of time, and let's talk about let's hear what Julian Morris from HitList has to say about trial startups, about funding for trial startups, because it's one of the problems. Apparently, investors, they don't necessarily like trial startups because trial is hard. It requires a lot of investment. There's all sorts of barriers that you need to have money for. And as an individual entrepreneur, and that's one of the problems that we've experienced as well, and a lot of our friends, is if you are an individual entrepreneur and you go to one of the big companies and ask them for inventory, more often than not, the answer is, oh, you have zero volume, therefore we don't care about you. That has to change. And I believe we have a very interesting project that will tackle that problem. And without further ado, if Julian is ready, I would like to invite to the stage Julian Morris from HitList. Thank you.
Is this on? Oh, that sounds like it's on.
We have a clicker here.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Julian Morris, the founder and CEO of HitList, which is an app that alerts you when there are cheap flights to places you want to go. My journey in the travel industry started about 7 years ago when I was an analyst working on high-risk infrastructure investments in the Middle East, which was the fastest growing aviation market in the world. So I advised Emirates Airlines, Qatar, Jazeera, which I'm not even sure is still around. It was a Kuwaiti airline. and some private equity players there. And I dove into the world of GDSs and airline technology, was fascinated, very puzzled by why things worked the way they did. And I started keeping track of the industry. I founded a company called TripCommon 5 years ago, ended up more or less shutting that down and pivoting into HitList 3.5 years ago. So I have seen this both from an investor and analyst side and also from an entrepreneur side. And I'd like to talk today about why investors hate travel and why they're wrong. So if anyone here has tried to get a travel startup off the ground, you've probably encountered a lot of resistance. There are a lot of investors who don't seem to want to touch the industry with a 10-foot pole. A few years ago, Y Combinator partner Gary Tan wrote this blog post about travel startups, the most common bad startup idea. And I feel like this just kind of crystallized a lot of the investor sentiment around the industry. And frankly, if you've been in the industry for a long time, it's hard to not get jaded. You see these like horrible, sort of not well thought out statistics all the time. Everyone's like, oh, this is a giant market, and there are trillions of dollars at play. Whenever someone says that their total addressable market is in the trillions, I tend to think that they're a little stupid. But you also see a lot of people saying, oh, it's really fragmented. This is probably the most cited statistic in all travel startup presentations is the average traveler visits 38 sites before making a booking. This comes from a Google study. Amusingly, they've put out this study a few times. In 2012, when I first saw it, it was 22 sites prior to a booking, and it keeps on increasing. So evidently the problem is getting worse, not better, but it's debatable how much of a problem is this. My approach to this, coming from the analyst side, was to start making a giant spreadsheet of investments in this area and any travel startups of note. And so gray are startups that are no longer around. Yellow, where acqui-hire didn't necessarily return any money to investors. White are still around. Green is good. Obviously, there are no greens here. There haven't been a lot of travel startups. And there are also a lot of times you'll see travel startups in the same exact doing the same problem over and over again. So if you ever go to a pitch competition or read some coverage, I think these are always the categories that you see most frequently. In my giant spreadsheet, which I now have over 400 travel startups that I've been tracking over the last 7 years, there are at least 20 in every single one of these categories. It's worth asking, why do travel startups die? And I think there are a few important things to consider if you're thinking of getting into this space, or if you are already thinking critically about what you're attacking and why. So first things first, it's too bad I think the animation is not working. I guess it's a PDF instead of a PowerPoint, because I really love GIFs. And this is a GIF of Christian Bale nodding very calmly, and Kermit the Frog nodding back very calmly. It doesn't really have the same effect when I describe it, does it? That's okay. One of the things that I see as an employer all the time is people send me job applications saying, I would be great for this position because I love to travel. And I'm like, frankly, that means nothing to me. I think it's important to be passionate about travel. I think that's a wonderful thing. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be passionate about solving the incredibly complicated problems that this industry faces. And in a very bizarre twist of events, our CTO has a phobia of flying and has never actually been on a flight. He's also one of the best massively scalable back-end engineers in the world, and so that mattered a lot more to me than his experience in travel himself. But a lot of people say, it's important to be passionate about what you're building. I totally agree, but there's a sad irony that once you start building a travel startup, you tend to not really travel in the same way anymore. So whenever I see a founder pitch and say, oh, I started this because I love to travel, I'm a consumer of travel, that doesn't really recommend them well. There's another, I'm so sad about these GIFs. Another common problem is building for what you know. So this is a common bit of startup advice is, build what you know, build for yourself. But the sad fact is if you are adventurous enough and have the time and money to take a shot on starting a travel company, you're probably richer, smarter, and more adventurous than 99% of the traveling population. So if you build something that's a product that you're going to use, it's not necessarily going to have a huge market. So over and over, when I see people building incredibly niche plays for incredibly adventurous travelers who want to meet locals, I tend to get kind of suspicious of how big that market really is. Because most people travel with friends and family, and I don't actually think that's as big a market as a lot of people think. The other big thing that is difficult for people breaking into this industry is just how entrenched a lot of the players are. It kind of sometimes feels like you've shown up 20 years late to a party. Just to take one illustrative example, and I swear this is just one, Brad Gerstner, and this is my puzzled Brad face, I like it a lot. He had a lot of sort of like generic headshots, but I went with this one. He started his career by rolling up American Express travel agencies. He then met a guy named Joel Cutler, who went on to found General Catalyst. Joel had previously founded a company called National Leisure Group, which he sold to America West, which sold to US Airways, which sold to American Airlines. Joel and Brad decided to buy National Leisure Group back from America West. The guy that they did the deal with there is the current CEO of American Airlines. National Leisure Group did deals with Priceline, Travelocity, Expedia, and Orbitz. The guy that he did the deal with at Orbitz was a young consultant who was in the process of setting that up, named Steve Hafner, who went on to found Kayak with funding from General Catalyst. Brad's co-CEO at National Leisure Group founded Silver Rail, which just sold to Expedia last week. National Leisure Group ultimately sold to IAC, and Brad started a company called Room 77 with investment from the founders of Expedia, Hotwire, and General Catalyst. Room 77, he's also an LP in General Catalyst by this time, which invested in Airbnb around the same time. Room 77 acquired Checkmate, which was founded by an early kayaker who founded Jetsetter, who sold that to TripAdvisor. Room 77 licensed technology to Google, ultimately sold to Lola and Expedia. Somehow they sold twice, different parts of their technology. And just for good measure, most recently, Brad led an activist campaign to install the former CEO of Orbitz on the United board successfully. So I love this sort of the 6 degrees of separation of Brad Gerstner is, again, not even that atypical. I could have picked any number of middle-aged white men and done the exact same thing. The number one thing at the end of the day, however, is consumers and consumer inertia. Everyone knows this, and so I don't need to dwell on this, but travel is an infrequent use case. People aren't taking that many trips a year, and making sure that they remember you when they're ready and primed to actually make a purchase or whatever is going to be important for you in your travel startup is incredibly, incredibly difficult, especially when you have Priceline and Expedia spending over $6 billion a year on Google ads. So getting in the game through paid marketing is nearly impossible. You should basically treat it as impossible if you're in the travel startup space. So you need to be very, very creative about educating consumers and keeping yourself top of mind. So with all of these terrible qualifications, why would you ever invest in travel? So a few reasons that I think are really important. First of all, I thought it was interesting to ask, is it really the most common bad startup idea? I went and pulled data from AngelList. So this is blue is the number of companies in the space, red is the number of investors who are interested in the space. So if you look at the ratio of the two, I think it's important to notice, I think a healthy ecosystem would have a lot of investors interested in a lot of companies. So by this measure, at least media and finance look to be much worse common startup ideas than travel. But even so, I think it's worth saying that people seem to think that there are travel startups all around the corner. It's not actually that common in a sector to dive into. It might be a more common sector for inexperienced people to dive into, but that was hard to pull out of the data. This GIF, if I can explain it, is someone with their finger in the bottom sort of, noodling on the dog, and then the dog freaks out and yells stop, S-T-A-H-P in true Doge language. sorry if you know your internet memes. I sound like a total nerd, that's okay. No travel company today is really loved by its user base, especially among millennials. There is less loyalty to any travel brand than almost any other sector. Millennials actually love their insurance brands and count themselves as more loyal to insurance products than they do to any travel brand. And I think that's incredibly depressing and a huge problem for the industry. And as Max was saying earlier, where problems are, there are also opportunities. So the fact that no one loves brands in travel, no one is loyal to a particular brand, means there's a lot of value that's left on the table. And I think that is played out in the multiples that people look at for travel. So this is a bunch of consumer mobile apps, and this chart is a few years out of date because I think it has Snapchat valued at $3 billion. It's a little bit more than that now. But if you look at I've always thought this was an interesting metric for valuing a consumer-facing tech company, which is basically for the annual value per user. And what their valuations would suggest that is. So if you look at this, Spotify is valued at $167 per user. Even Facebook at its IPO was valued at over $100 per user. If you can imagine a travel company that was actually valued based on a loyal user base and what they could end up spending, it's sort of staggering. I mean, the average American spends over $3,000 a year on travel. So Spotify, I don't know how many of you subscribe there. You're looking at $9 a month, $9.99 a month, so that's $120. If you actually had someone, a brand that was able to capture it, this could be incredibly, incredibly exciting. And I think would be valued at much more. That hasn't historically been the case in travel. Companies are valued as revenue multiple. So Momondo, which sold recently for $500 million on revenues of around $100 million, is a fairly standard example. But if you look at the way that media companies and other consumer-facing companies are valued, it should be much higher. Which brings me back to the stat that I know I mentioned earlier. The thing that bothers me in travel startup presentations is when people say, oh, the numbers are really, really big, it's a $1 trillion market. But there is some truth to that, and depending on exactly which market you're focusing on, there are some really, really interesting things to draw out. So travel spending is 27% of every dollar spent online, so more than 1 in 4 dollars spent online are in travel. Priceline is the 3rd largest e-commerce company in the world after Amazon and Alibaba, and Priceline still has less than 10% market share worldwide. Favorite stat that I just learned relatively recently, there are more than $2 trillion worth of planes in service right now. So if you talk about the hardware side, which I feel like, I know this conference is based on travel tech, and I think most of the talks are going to be dedicated to software, but I think there's incredibly interesting things that we could look at around battery technology, more efficient flights. Of course, Boom Supersonic just raised $30 million or so to build a new supersonic aircraft. So there are, I hadn't really realized that $2 trillion worth of planes, that does seem like a lot. And mobile, I think, is still a huge opportunity that has not been capitalized on in travel in terms of the capacity for personalization. This is kind of like a throwaway slide. Everyone knows mobile is big, but honestly, you haven't seen any of the legacy players actually do creative things with the capacity to have a supercomputer that you can talk to. People opt in to push notifications, and I think that's a tremendous opportunity in the market. Mobile bookings are growing incredibly quickly. They've plateaued a little bit. This data runs out in 2015, so it's a little out of date from 2016. It doesn't increase a ton more. It doesn't increase at the same velocity, but it's still increasing, and that's probably going to end up being the majority of bookings. And I don't think anyone has a good mobile booking experience other than Hotel Tonight, which another friend of mine always is like, I'm so sick of hearing about Hotel Tonight. They're talked about at every conference. I feel like they haven't been lately because they haven't been doing as well according to the sort of hype machine. But if you've ever booked with Hotel Tonight, you know what an extremely pleasant experience that is. And then finally, and the reason that we're here today is to talk about the technical underpinnings of this industry. And we have the capacity to do things today that haven't been attacked for a long time. So if you're interested in the hard tech behind airfare pricing, the absolute standard thing that you must read is Carl DeMarkin's 2003 paper, which is really easy. If you just Google it, it's the computational complexity of air travel planning. And if you go back and read this paper, and if you have any knowledge of mathematics or computer science, you realize that a lot of the problems that he lists as basically insurmountable are very, very approachable today with the improvements in machine learning and just basically computational power. So we haven't seen a lot of, I haven't seen a lot of companies doing innovative work in this space since ITA. Which has always been the saddest thing for me, that it sold so early. I think it could have had so much more potential to do great things for the industry. And then, of course, there's always the new distribution capability that was put out by IATA. It is a flawed standard, but it still has a lot of potential to sort of create an open source ecosystem around airfare data. I'm sure there are probably people at this conference who can talk to that in more depth, and the capacity to also look at the implications for blockchain and distributed networks of information in this industry, which I think we also have a talk on later. I'm just the trailer for the conference, evidently. Despite the fact that there are many, many problems in this industry, there's also tremendous benefits to being in it for the long term. As someone who has been sort of active in the industry for maybe 4 years, but looking at it for a long time, I think it's one of the most tremendously exciting. And also, on a very personal note, I think it's one of the most promising in terms of, as someone who lived and worked in a lot of developing countries and conflict zones, I think the travel industry is one of those weird industries where everyone kind of working in their own self-interest actually ends up producing positive externalities and being great for development in terms of creating jobs, creating understanding, and moving wealth around the world. So it's an incredibly exciting industry to be in. So I hope you see a little bit more about why investors don't like this space, but also why they should take into account a little bit more. So thank you very much. I don't know if that's, I don't actually know where I am on timing. Am I over or under? A little under. All right. Thank you.
Julian, a few questions?
Sure.
Someone raise a hand. Do you have questions?
Yes.
Why did you start HitList? Because you like to travel?
She asked, why did I start HitList? There are many answers to that. Yes, I love to travel, but no.
That's easy.
Right, no, of course. So I think that so on a practical level, I was living in Istanbul, Turkey, and all my friends promised they were going to come and visit me, and none of them did. Until I started sending them flight alerts when I saw cheap flights to Istanbul. And all of a sudden, I would send 5 emails to people in New York saying, this is a great price, you said you wanted to come, book it now. And 4 people would book tickets. And if you compare that to, if you just leave people to their own devices, they don't tend to book. But if you give them just a little bit of assistance and a little bit of guidance, they'll book at a much higher frequency. So you get people to take trips that they have said that they want to, but don't get around to taking. I think that's a gigantic part of the market that's very underserved. I think around 25% of trips that happen right now are somewhat flexible on date and destination. And so that's the market that HitList focuses on most. Trips that you kind of want to take, but haven't got completely firm plans for yet, and so are going to be impacted a lot by price. I also think there's a gigantic part of the market that is totally unserved right now, which is all the sort of the trips that are currently just not getting taken at all. So that's, it could go on much longer, but I'll stop there. Yes?
So I think one important point you made is about the loyalty or lack of loyalty and also, of course, the difficulty of, if you don't do it a lot, remembering where to go to. So there's this whole part of you could innovate, but it sounds like you could also focus on existing solutions and improve those, right?
Absolutely.
Improve those. And it seems like Expedia and Priceline are basically overcoming it by just throwing a lot of money at it. What are some thoughts on how a startup or just new solutions could improve on existing solutions so that consumers become more loyal, that they do value the company they go to and want to come back?
I think the important thing is to not play in the same playing field, so not try and build something exactly like Priceline or Expedia, to build a clone of that. Some people in this room might know the story of Travana, which was here recently and apparently went through $26 million in 10 months trying to build an essential Expedia Priceline clone. That didn't work out so well. And so I think it's important to have a product that's differentiated. And then beyond that, it's all the standard startup stuff, which is know your users, interview them, A/B test aggressively, and just keep on trying. I don't think there's never a, if there were an easy formula, everyone would be doing it, right?
AI, chatbots, conversational commerce in travel. Bad or lasting trend?
I think it is not going to be a huge part of the industry. I think at least the companies that exist as they do right now, I don't think the text interface is a great one for planning travel. It's a pain it takes a lot more clicks to write in San Francisco than to just select it from a drop-down menu, much less put in all of your other constraints. And I also think the complexity of building an AI that can, at scale and with correct unit economics, actually address people's travel issues is not in the 5-year horizon, maybe not even in the 10-year horizon. Linguistic complexity is a nearly insurmountable problem, I think. I do think that there are opportunities to use chatbots to engage people so I think, I was talking about this with someone earlier, I think Hello Scout is a really interesting company in this space. They basically partner with hotels and act as a hotel's concierge through text and message people 5 days before they're going to arrive and try and upsell them things basically and make sure that they have a good stay. I think those types of models are very promising. The idea of a full service AI travel agent, I have a lot of doubts around. And I think the companies that are working in this space, the Panas and the Lolas, Pana has a subscription product. They're focused on small and medium-sized businesses. I think that might have some legs. They might be able to finance that. Lola, as far as I can tell, is just burning venture capital money, subsidizing travel agents, doing all of the work, and doesn't really have any AI. And I doubt that that's sustainable. Yeah?
Yeah, you mentioned that. Sorry, if you have a question, can we just... Oh, does it work? No. Okay, go ahead. All right, so you mentioned that there's tremendous opportunity in mobile, around social and some other things like that. And you mentioned that one have to rule them all. Why do you think much progress has not been made in that phase? And if we're going to break it, how do we break it?
Could I please just ask you to repeat the question?
The question was, why has there not been big movement in the mobile space? And I think there have been a lot of smaller companies, but it's been very hard to break through. It's very hard to get mobile app installs at scale. And the big companies that have, so TripAdvisor is the most installed mobile app. And I'm sorry if there's anyone here who's ever worked on that TripAdvisor mobile app, but I think it is one of the worst mobile apps out there. It still feels like it was built in like 1995, but there weren't even apps then. So the big companies have not capitalized on their advantage and done much creative stuff. And I think, frankly, that's a measure of lack of competition and maybe somewhat dysfunctional management.
Thank you, Jillian. Thank you so much.
Is it working? Cool. All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Adam Goldstein. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Hipmunk. I do not have slides today. I want this to be more of an interactive session about what challenges you're facing as you go through the experience of starting a travel company or trying to build technology in the travel industry. How many of you here are right now founders of a travel business? All right. How many of you think in the next year or so that's a direction you might want to head? It's a bad idea. All right, the rest of you, if you didn't raise your hand, do you work in the travel business but not at a startup? Raise your hand. Yeah. Okay, so there's a good mix of things. I'll try to gear this towards stories that would be relevant for different groups. Let's first start with the group of people who are thinking of starting travel startups or have already started them. So just like Julian, I was someone who had a lot of interest personally in the problem that Hipmunk was trying to solve. I was booking a lot of travel in college for my friends on the debate team, of all things. We would travel each week to a different place. And I was so frustrated with how much time I was spending searching different travel sites that I thought that if I could just build a better product, a better experience, then I could just take over the industry and it would be awesome. That was my thought process. And I suspect that for many of you who've started travel companies or who are thinking about starting travel companies, that you have sort of a similar mental framework for thinking about how it's going to go. You start with a problem, you build something that solves it better, and then it's going to work. It's not actually how things work. But often it might seem that that's the way that things work from the outside. If you hear the stories of companies like Airbnb or Kayak or TripAdvisor, you might get the impression that these companies had built something that solved a problem better than the competitors and then quickly grew, and it was nothing but straight up and to the right. And don't get me wrong, there are examples of companies like that, but most travel companies, most companies in general, that's not the case. I'll give you a story from our personal experience. So we launched Hipmunk in the summer of 2010. We launched it after we felt like we'd built something better than Kayak. That was our standard for launch, something that we would prefer and that our friends would prefer to use over Kayak. And on day one, we had something like 20,000 unique visitors, which is insane. No travel startup ever gets that many. We hit the exact right time. We got a bunch of good press on day one. Day two, we had like 25,000 unique visitors. Day three, we had like 30,000 unique visitors. It was like first 3 days up and to the right. And I remember my co-founder and I, who had been losing sleep leading up to the launch, we were so relaxed at this point. We were like, hey, we've hit it. We're done. We can go retire. This is going to be great. That's not actually how it worked, because on day 4, we went from 30,000 to about 15,000. Day 5, we were at like 10,000. Day 6, we were at 5,000. Anyone want to take a guess how long it took for us to get back to that day 3 peak? Raise your hand. I want 2 or 3 guesses on this. Yeah, Max. A year. Another guess. 2 years. Another guess. 2 years is right. 2 years. That's how long it took. 2 years to get back to where we were on day 3. And this is actually a very common story for travel companies. It's a very common story for companies in general. That day that you launch or that week that you launch, if you really line up all of the different people at the right time, if you get the press, if you get some interviews, if you get mentions in social media and everything, you can build a critical mass of attention so that people in your target market hear about you multiple times in the same week. And if people hear about you multiple times in the same week, then that gives you a prospect of getting one of those people to try you, just like Expedia or Trivago, who's hitting people multiple times in a week on TV gets. So when you're an early stage startup, you can replicate what it takes to get people to try you out, but the problem is that then that goes away. Reporters are not willing to write about your exciting new beta after they've already written about your alpha. Or they're not willing to write about the new feature after you've already launched the new product. Or they might be, but the fact that you launched something a week ago means that they're not going to write about you for another 6 months. And so this is the dilemma that a lot of travel companies face, and it's certainly the dilemma that we faced, is that PR is not a long-term growth strategy. In fact, if anything, it is a hack. And it's a hack that can be damaging because it can make you think that you've actually built something that's going to scale for a very long time when actually you've only papered over the fact that you haven't really built a growth strategy. And so if I had to point out the biggest mistake that we made and the biggest mistake that I see other travel startups make, it's this assumption that you will get from a better product to a big success just on the basis of the quality of your product. Because that is not how things work in general, and it's especially not how things work in the travel industry. When you are competing against other companies who are getting their message out multiple times every week, you need to have something that can compete with that frequency of reaching people. That is what it takes. It's not just that you need a better product. I don't think anyone here would say that the major OTAs or meta-search sites have the best products in the market. I mean, if you think so, great. I don't know why you're here. But if you agree that there's actually a lot of room to improve, you have to wonder, what is it about the industry that is allowing these big companies with subpar experiences to continue to grow so quickly when so many startups are failing? And I believe the reason is because they've figured out a way to reach people multiple times every week. TV is one way. They send emails almost every day if you're on their mailing list. You see ads on Facebook, you see ads on Google. When you search on Google, you see their brand in the results. You hear about them from friends, you hear about them in the media. You take all of these things together and you get a lot of people who are hearing about the same companies over and over and over again. And that is how they're able to keep growing. And that is why it's very difficult for a startup. Now, how many people in here have studied mathematics, or particularly like proofs, different kinds of ways of proving that something's true? So one of the ways that I like to think about this is when you're building a startup, a lot of companies, a lot of founders think that what they're trying to do is to prove that they can reach a certain scale. That if they can prove to investors that they've got 1 million users or $1 million a year in revenue, that they will have proved that they can be a success and that they'll be able to raise money and they'll be able to hire people. That is exactly the wrong way to think about it. Reaching a certain milestone, reaching a certain number of users or a certain number of dollars is a great way to feel good about yourself. But once again, it can be a way to actually focus on things that don't build long-term value for your company. Another mistake we made was thinking, hey, once we reach $1 million in revenue, we're going to have investors who are knocking down our doors. Or once we reach 1 million unique visitors. We thought that that was going to be sort of what got us into the big kids club. Well, it sort of does. I mean, those things do matter. It is an accomplishment to reach 1 million users or to reach $1 million. But what investors and acquirers and other major players in the industry care about is not that you can prove that you can reach a point, but that you can prove that you can build a system to keep growing beyond that point. That's the key insight. It's not proof by existence. It's not that we exist at this level. It's proof by induction that you can turn where you are today into a repeatable strategy for getting bigger over time. That is what the essence of building a successful startup is. And so many companies, including Hipmunk, focused so heavily in the early days on building that product that was going to prove that they could be better. That thing that we just knew was that people were going to love when they saw it. And we didn't spend enough time thinking about how could we get from that point to build a system to get even bigger from there. And once we started thinking about that, a few years into the company, that's when things started going our way. But in the first few years, we were in this, what Y Combinator calls the trough of sorrow. This place where we felt like we were sure we'd built a better product, but we didn't have a strategy for reaching people frequently enough to get them to come into the product and use it. And once we started focusing on that, a lot of people in the company were sort of annoyed because they thought that they were coming to work at a company where they were going to build products every day. They were going to make the features better. They were going to make the experience better. But in order to actually make the company succeed, we needed to spend a lot of our time focusing on things to build that machine to keep the company growing, to reach more people and to reach them more often. Building an email list, building a program to reach people by email, building a mobile app with notifications so that people would come back into the app. Often we found that there was a tension between the growth strategy that we needed to pursue and the sense of purity that people had around the product. How many of you have co-founders or employees who just think it would be really bad to have ads in your product? Raise your hand. How many of you have co-founders or employees who think that it would be spammy to have a little overlay on your screen where people land that asks them to put in their email address. How many of you have ever heard that sort of a complaint? How many of you allow dogs at work? Yeah, we do too. So all of these conceptions, right, this notion of purity, there's an implicit judgment that's taking place, and I think it's important for you to understand it and for you to be able to recognize it. When people say that the product's purity is threatened, and that dictates your product strategy, what they're essentially saying is that it is more important for the company to have a product that is pure than for the company to grow. Right? When these things come into tension, is it actually the case that it's more important to have a pure product than a company that's growing? I would argue no. Unless you're profitable already, you need to be growing so that you can get to the point of profitability or to the point that you can raise money. And so these things that people get all, sort of fight these religious battles over, we certainly did, really actually have a very straightforward answer. If you want to grow, you need to do things that either make you money or get people to come back to your site. And it is not always the case that a pure experience is going to do a better job of making you money or getting people to come back to your service. In fact, often the purest experience is one that will have people come to you less often because your impure competitors, Expedia, Kayak, Priceline, they have no concern whatsoever about collecting their users' email addresses, about sending them email, about putting a little blocker ad in the experience that basically forces you to sign up, where they run advertisements on their site so that they can make money so that they can go out and reach new users. Do you think that anyone at Expedia or Kayak is sitting there saying, oh no, we can't make more money, that would make our experience impure? No, that is not how it works, right? And so this is where I think a lot of startups fail. This is where we almost failed. We had multiple situations in which we were down to single-digit months of cash. At one point, we had 2 weeks of cash left because we did not make a priority early enough on deciding that we were going to make the compromises necessary to focus on growth as the objective rather than this sort of ephemeral notion of the purity of our product. So that's one thing that I think is a lesson for all travel startups. And the sooner that you absorb that lesson, the likelier it is that you are going to succeed. And the longer you wait to absorb that lesson, the longer you wait to have that difficult conversation with your employees and your co-founders, the less likely it is that you are actually going to survive for long enough to have the impact on the industry that you want. So that's a story for travel startups and people thinking about starting travel startups. Now I want to flip to the perspective of a company that's established, because it seems like about a third of the people in the room are people who work at other travel businesses. Now let me tell you about what it's like to work at a travel business, or really at any business at all. Because I think this is a useful mindset to understand. You're an airline, you're a hotel, you're a travel agency. You're getting bombarded with startup ideas all the time. You're getting pitched, hey, we're a startup, we would love to have access to your data. Or we're a travel startup, we'd like to do a partnership with you where we send you leads and you pay us. I mean, having now run a travel business for 7 years and no longer a startup, I get these emails by the dozen a week. Startups in the US, outside the US. The same startup I heard from last week who somehow learned that being persistent was more likely to get me to reply. They just send me all of these emails. Sometimes they call me. I don't know how they get my phone number. Sometimes they corner me at conferences. Sometimes they come to conferences just so that they can corner me. Sometimes they don't buy a pass to the conference because they can't afford to, but they stand right outside the door and then they corner me so that they can ask if they can get access to my data or if they can send me leads and have me pay them. This is the experience of what it's like to work at an established travel company, particularly if you work either as a manager or in partnerships or in product. And I was on the other side of that. I was a travel entrepreneur, and I was sending emails every week. We didn't have a source of data. How many of you guys that are travel startups are sort of feeling uneasy about where you're getting your data from, whether it's going to last forever? If you're not raising your hand, you should be, because every data source in the industry is sort of at will. There's no guarantee that any of these data sources will last forever. So with 2 weeks left before demo day at Y Combinator, we knew that we needed to get data or else we were not going to be able to launch this thing. And when I say we needed to get data, we needed a legitimate source of data. We couldn't be like scraping sites. That would never work if we were actually publicly launched. So we went into a scramble mode. And what I learned, some sort of key insight that I learned in the early days, was that that in-person meeting was much more likely to get us what we wanted than just sending out emails. In fact, the way that we were able to get the data to launch, this startup that no one had ever heard of because we'd never launched, was I emailed Orbitz and I told them that I was going to be in Chicago the following week and I'd really appreciate a chance to meet in person. I was not planning to be in Chicago the following week. I was hoping that they were going to say yes so that I could go and meet them. And I don't know what it is, but something about telling someone that you're going to be near them suddenly turns people from ignoring your email to at least reading your email. And in this case, I guess the person I emailed had a good morning that morning, and so she actually decided that she would take the meeting. That was how we were able to get launched, that initial data set. And over time, as we needed to do partnerships with airlines directly and with hotels, I learned that actually this was a repeatable pattern. If you meet with people in person, you're much more likely to get them to at least hear you out, and you're more likely to get them to say yes than if you're just sitting behind your desk, sending emails, and then feeling sorry for yourself about the fact that no one's actually replied to them. And I've learned this, it doesn't just work at startups. We're an established company. When we were going out to raise money, I would try to avoid sending the emails just for the sake of pitching, and I would ask friends of mine to get me an introduction that would lead to an in-person meeting with a venture capitalist. And those had much higher rates of success. But this sort of goes against the grain for the tech industry. The whole point of email, the whole point of Slack, the whole point of all of these technologies ostensibly is to reduce the necessity of in-person meetings, which are hugely inefficient, especially if you have to travel a long distance to have them. But what I've observed is that the fact that you are willing to take the time to go and visit someone or to make the time in your calendar for an in-person meeting, it's not just that meeting in person you get sort of to know the other person better. It's that you also are signaling something about how important it is to you. That just the fact that you are committing that time, you're dedicating that effort to make the in-person meeting, that is actually something that reflects a certain degree of investment, that this is not something that you're doing to 20 different companies, but that there's something about this particular person or this particular business that really rises to the level that it's worth your time to meet with them. So this is one of the other pieces of advice that I give to startups, but I think it applies to anyone who works in the travel industry, which is this is an industry where you're expected to travel. Your competitors are traveling to meet with their partners. Your partners are traveling to meet with your competitors. If you are not traveling to be there in person to have these meetings, you are going to be at a competitive disadvantage. And that's true whether you're in a startup or whether you're in an established company. That is the way that this business works. It may be the case in others. This has been the business I've spent the last 7 years in, and I know it's the case here. And if that's not something that you're comfortable doing, then you're going to have a lot of trouble succeeding in your career or succeeding with your startup. All right, the next story that I want to tell you is the story about what it's like to raise money. Because startups often hear stories about how you go about putting together a pitch deck, or they hear from friends or friends of friends about these enormous amounts of money that they've raised. Or like Jillian, they look at how much money these companies like Lola are raising, and instead of looking and being like, wow, that's kind of crazy, they're like, oh, wow, it must be really easy to raise money then, because look at how much money they've raised. Well, here's the thing. It's neither easy nor hard to raise money. It's just random. Like, sometimes it's easy, sometimes it's hard. Sometimes the same investor will hear the same pitch one year and they'll say yes, and then the next year they'll say no, or vice versa. It's like, it's very hard to put together a unified theory of what fundraising is like, because it's just subject to all of these different variables, some of which aren't even apparent, like what time of day you're meeting with the VC. Like, are they pissed off because the company that they talked to last is underperforming after they invested in it? So you just can't know all of these things. But there's a few tips that I've learned that can increase your odds. The first one is you need to create a sense of inevitability. So when you think about the way that you get investors to say yes, what an investor is basically saying yes to is that the money that they're putting in today is likely to increase over time, right? That's what an investor does. If they don't make money over time, on average, then they're not going to be an investor for very long. So how do you convince them that you're going to make money over time? Anyone have any ideas? What's the best way to convince an investor that you're going to make money for them?
Make money over time.
Yeah. If you can actually show a track record, that's a really good indicator. What else? What's that? Yeah, exactly. So if you can show a history of it, yeah.
Show competitor who made money.
Show competitors who've made money? Maybe. That can cut either way, because they might wonder whether that competitor has already sort of captured the opportunity. There's another one, yeah.
Try to convince them that you're successful right now.
Yeah, convince them that you're successful right now. I talked earlier about showing them that you've got a strategy for continuing to grow. Yeah? Make them like you. So you guys have missed one of the most cynical but true reasons why investors invest, which is that they think that other investors are going to invest in the future, or that other acquirers are going to be interested in the future, right? When you hear, you've probably heard that it's considered kind of gauche to talk about your exit strategy. It is. That doesn't mean that VCs aren't thinking about it from the moment that they meet you. How is this company going to sell or IPO in the future? Because that's the only way that investors make money. If the company never sells, if there's never a way for the investors to cash out their money, then they can't actually make money on your company. Like, it's really as simple as that. So the best way to create a sense that your company is going to succeed is to convince investors that other investors are interested. Very circular, but true. So how do you convince investors that other investors are interested? Well, one way to do it is to tell them that you have a term sheet. But here's the problem. If you lie about that, then you're going to ruin your reputation forever with all investors. And so investors know that you're not going to say you have a term sheet unless you actually have a term sheet, which means that if you don't say you have a term sheet, investors know you don't have a term sheet. And if you don't have a term sheet, then that means that you haven't yet convinced any other investors to invest in your company. And if you haven't yet convinced any other investors to invest in your company, then that means that there's still a lot of uncertainty as to whether your company is actually going to be able to be successful. I've seen so many startups in travel and in other industries who end up in this sort of like middle hazy ground where they've got a bunch of investors who are interested, but none who are interested enough to write a term sheet. None who are actually interested enough to commit to putting money into the company. They just get stuck in limbo where they've got a good story, but it's not quite good enough to get anyone over the line. And then those companies, those VCs, realize that this company has been trying to raise money for a month or two and hasn't yet been successful at getting a term sheet. And then they start to wonder whether maybe other investors have picked up some problem with this company, and then they decide that it's not worth their time. So how do you overcome this coordination problem, right? How do you actually make it so that investors realize that they should, or start to believe that you're going to be able to raise money in the future, even if you don't have a term sheet today? There's a few strategies. One, you can be growing so quickly that every investor knows it's just a matter of time before other investors are interested. This would be the strategy for Facebook, Twitter, Airbnb. You know, they just have such incredible momentum that no one doubts when they come in to pitch that they're going to be able to raise money from somewhere. If you can pull that off, you're in great shape. Good luck. The second possibility is that you don't actually need to raise money. So if you're profitable, or if you're just breaking even, then investors know that you don't need their money. Now, sure, you might like their money. Generally, money is good. You can put it to good use. You can pay yourself a salary, but you don't need the money. So if you're profitable, you will attract more investors because they know that you don't need them. They know that whatever money they put in, the risk that it's going to disappear is much reduced. So yeah, I mean, maybe the company will grow 2x in the next year, maybe it'll grow 4x in the next year, but at least they're not going to lose their money. That gives investors a great deal of confidence to be the first one to put in an offer. And the third way that you can break this coordination problem is by actually creating a sense of urgency where every investor is nervous that any day now someone else is going to put in the money. And if you can successfully create that sense of competition, then you can get someone to say, look, I am so sure that you're going to raise money that I'm going to put in the first offer so that you like me the most because I was the guy that offered you the money first. If you can create a sense of competition, then you can actually sort of kickstart the process. I'll give you a story from Hipmonk's real life story, from Hipmonk's own experience. At one of our fundraisers, I'm not going to tell you which because there's some sensitivities around this. We were in a situation where we had a bunch of investors who were sort of circling, but we didn't have any that had yet given us a term sheet. And we kind of needed the money. I mean, we didn't totally need the money, but if we didn't raise the money, we're going to probably have to cut a bunch of people from the company. We're going to have to scale back on a lot of our growth efforts. It was just going to be really unfortunate. So we had one investor who was particularly interested, and we had a bunch that were somewhat interested, and then we had a bunch that had started saying no. We'd actually gotten hard no's from them. And we got nervous because we'd been raising money. We'd been trying to raise money for about a month. We knew that word was going to start getting around, that we'd had some people, some good firms who'd said no. And we really wanted to create some heat so that this investor who was the most interested really decided that they should be the first one to put in an offer. So what we did was we called a friend who worked as a venture capitalist, who, by the way, had already said no. He didn't want to invest, but he was a friend. And we brought him into our office, and we scheduled it so that he was in our office, sitting there, talking to me and my co-founder in a glass-walled room that faced the entrance to the office when the other investor who was interested came into the office. We didn't lie about anything. We didn't say that this guy had given us a term sheet, because he hadn't. In fact, he'd said that he was not going to give us a term sheet. We were just sitting there. The guy walked into the room. You could see his eyes sort of widen, like, oh, shit. This other guy, this really reputable investor, he must be interested. And the next day, we got an offer from the investor. And it was a better offer than what we'd expected. Yeah, well, so the point here is, it is a game, right? It is a game. You have to play the game honestly. If someone asks you if you have a term sheet and you don't, you cannot say you do. You will never be able to raise money again. I don't know if you'll even be able to live with yourself again. Some people can do that. Some people do lie about this stuff. That word always gets around. But it is a game. You do need to be able to think the way that the incentives are set up. The investors want to invest in companies that other investors want to invest in. However you need to create that sense of urgency, that sense of competition, that's how you are going to be able to raise money. And if you can't create that sense of competition, it doesn't matter how good your product is, and it doesn't matter how good your growth is. If you need money and you can't convince investors that there's going to be a competitive situation, you will find it very difficult, if not impossible, to actually get the money. So I think over these last few examples, I've given you a sense for what it is that it takes to be successful as a travel startup. And you've probably noticed that as I keep adding these examples, the importance of how good your product is sort of dropping further and further down the list of most important factors. So we've learned that the most important thing for raising money is convincing people that you're going to be able to raise money, which has basically nothing to do with your product. Another important thing is the ability to build some long-term growth driver, even if it makes your product worse. There's other stuff like how well you're able to hire people, how well you're able to manage your cash burn. All of those things come before how good your product is on the list. And yet my guess is that every one of you or almost every one of you who started a travel company or is thinking of starting a travel company, in your head, or in terms of how you prioritize your time, that list is flipped. You're probably spending 80% of your time thinking, or more, thinking about how you're going to make your product the best it can possibly be. You're thinking about how once you do that, you're going to be able to raise money, you're going to be able to hire people, you're going to be able to make money, you're going to be able to build a growth strategy because your product's so great. You have it backwards. Now, that's not to say that a product isn't important. It is on the list. That product, it's somewhere, maybe top 5 on the list is your product. But it is not the most important thing. At almost any point in your company's life, it is not the most important thing. And I think that is the key mistake that we made. If we'd learned that sooner, we would have been able to scale up and do more good work for our product sooner. We would have been able to raise money sooner. We would have been able to reach more people sooner. All of those things would have happened sooner if we'd realized that actually the product was not the most important thing. It was just one of the important things. So hopefully these sorts of stories give you guys a little bit of context of what the process of going from an early stage, nearly failed startup to a company that was able to be acquired and reach millions of people is like. There was a lot of luck along the way, but there was also a lot of recognition that our original vision for how we were going to succeed had to change in light of the games that we had to play in order to win. And I hope that when you sort of digest this and when you look at the way that your own businesses are going, that you realize that whatever vision you have, you also need to make room for these other components that are almost completely orthogonal, but that have a much better chance of helping you succeed over time. Time for a few questions. Yeah?
Can you talk a little bit about how you negotiated the exit? Hello?
Yes.
Hey, Adam. I'm Zach.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit how you negotiated the exit of Hitmonk? I think maybe some people would be interested in that if they ever get
There's not much that I'm allowed to say about that because it's covered by a non-disclosure agreement. But I can tell you in general, we've had acquisition conversations pretty much from the day that we launched. And the advice that I gave you about raising money applies almost 100% to acquisitions. The people who are most likely to, the situation in which you're the most likely to be acquired in a deal that you are excited about is a situation in which acquirers think that other acquirers are interested. If you can create that competition, that's when you can be in the driver's seat if you are interested in being acquired. And if you're not interested in being acquired, it's sort of the equivalent of being profitable, where people just have to make a really good offer to get you to say yes.
Is there any stories you can tell about maybe failed acquisition attempts? You said it's been going on long.
Yeah, I mean, I think like a lot of entrepreneurs, the first time that someone from corporate development at a travel company called us, 2 weeks after we'd launched, we were like, wow, someone from corporate development, maybe they want to acquire us. And then we were thinking, well, wouldn't it be great if we sold the company after 2 weeks, we could go retire, It's the same sort of thought process. A lot of entrepreneurs kind of get caught up in this. The thing about corporate development people is that their job is to research every company. Whether or not they're interested in acquiring them today, they would be failing in their responsibility if they missed out on a company. So they love to keep tabs on everyone. The fact that they're calling, they might even say, we're interested in acquiring you. But it's the corporate development person who's interested. It's not the CEO of the company who's interested in acquiring you. And so they play these games either deliberately or sort of coincidentally in which they can sort of make you get really excited about selling to them, and they can use that as a way to suss out whether you're desperate to sell or whether you're open to selling or whether you're really not open to selling, and that steers them towards whether they're interested in buying you. Because no one wants to buy a company that's desperate to sell. That is obvious. No investor wants to invest in a company that's desperate to raise money. Everyone likes to buy and invest in winners. So I guess the experience of having these conversations over time was that even the fact that we were willing to have the conversation in those early days was actually a negative signal to the corp dev people. Like if you're a company that's just launched 2 weeks ago and the head of corporate development for a travel company emails you and you reply within 24 hours, that corporate development person's probably thinking less of you. They're probably thinking like, wow, these people either it's not going the way they want or they just started this company because they wanted to sell it. Whereas actually what was happening was we were just kind of curious to know what they wanted to say. So I guess the lesson would be careful when people are contacting you that you don't indicate something that's not the truth about what you're interested in. One more question.
All right. So my name is Palumi. You mentioned that, granted, the quality, the strength of your product is not the holy grail for success.
Right.
So for us to make a decision to prioritize any of these items, what would you say is number one? What would you say is number two? Is product number three? I mean, like if we're forced to make that prioritization.
It depends on what you want. It depends on what stage your company's at. If your goal is to build a business that can pay you a salary for the rest of your life, then growth may not be the most important thing. Just reaching profitability might be the most important thing. And you might need to prioritize work on your product that makes you money over work that makes your product better. And that's fine. If your objective is to have a 1 in 100 chance of making $1 billion company, then you're going to prioritize growth first, right? You're going to say, making money is not as important, making the product perfect is not as important. We're going to spend all of our time focusing on how we reach as many people as possible and get them to come back to us so that we can grow as quickly as possible. This is sort of the general lesson would just be, think about what it is that you want and then make your strategic decisions in response to that. Don't let your love of your product force you into a strategy where product purity is the most important thing if that's actually not what you want out of your company over time. I think we're out of time. Thanks.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you. And our next speaker is Mike Caleta from Focusrite. Mike, thank you so much for being here.
Sure, my pleasure. Everyone hear me?
Let me just pull up your slides.
Thanks. So I'm Michael Caleta, Manager of Research and Innovation at Focusrite. You may have seen me here Monday as a judge at the pitch competition, and yesterday I did a Q&A workshop, and today I'm here speaking. So hopefully you're not sick of me yet, but hopefully I've been able to offer some insight that's been helpful to you all. I want to thank Max and Marina for the opportunity to engage with everyone, and also just say excellent job on putting together a great 3 days of content. And to Jillian and Adam too, I mean, those were really two of the most jam-packed, insightful presentations that I've seen, very specific to travel startups. So really, really excellent stuff, and I appreciate those presentations too, and I'll be underscoring some of the points that they made. So just a little bit about Focusrite. We're widely considered the travel industry research authority. A lot of our research and data is used and widely cited as benchmarks in the industry. We publish statistics on market growth, OTAs versus suppliers, desktop versus mobile, that are often referred to. A lot of opinion pieces on trends. Norm writes a lot of those. Happy to have him here too. And we do deep dives into lots of different verticals within the industry. And we run some of the most influential conferences. The flagship conference is the Focusrite Conference, runs every November. Attracts about 1,800 attendees, mostly high-level executives. It's where you'll see a lot of the CEOs of most of the major travel corporations. And startup pitch competitions are a major part of our events. We've had 284 innovators at this point take our stages, and those companies have raised $2.2 billion collectively. So we feel it works very well as really being the place to present an innovation to the travel industry. We run a conference in Europe and in India where we have battleground startup competitions. And we just recently launched the Battleground as a standalone event, so that'll be September 12th in Sunnyvale at Plug and Play. And I'll mention a few more details about that in a bit. So today I'm here to present a little bit of our research from our State of Travel Startups report. We've tracked 1,252 travel startups since 2005, tracked their activity, funding amounts, et cetera. And these companies have raised $32.6 billion so far. I just recently joined Focusrite, actually about 7 weeks ago, and I'll be overhauling our methodology by which we collect data and track companies. So I'm really excited about the next version of the report. This data is from the 2016 report. It's the last time we had a really comprehensive data set. But I expect to be adding a lot more companies soon that we'll be tracking. And I hope a lot of you will be included in the report. I know some people here, I'm sure your companies are already included. And we look at the industry across, and we categorize companies into some major verticals and horizontals. In reality, the ontology of the travel industry probably has hundreds of categories. We're actually actively working now on mapping out what those are. Just under air, you have hundreds of possible ways to look at what companies are working on. But for presentation purposes, we look at air, lodging, ground transportation, and grouping companies together that way. And across horizontals, of course, search and booking are important categories. Data analytics, mobile, of course, too. So to get into some of the numbers, here are the companies that we've tracked since 2005. We track companies that we think are going to have a meaningful impact on the industry or already are. So beyond the idea stage, and really things that we think are going to affect how people plan travel or really meaningful to the industry. And so we see quite clearly here a bubble of sorts around the solo-mo years. A lot of companies were launched around mobile first, social media, sharing economy, et cetera. And then a bit of a tapering off there. And we add companies, like I said, as they gain traction, credibility. So these numbers wind up getting inflated as we move on. This year we'll add more companies in 2013, 14, 15, et cetera. But this trend generally holds true. There's been a bit of a lull that we've seen in founding opportunity, but I do see that bouncing back in a big way. We have a lot of new, exciting technologies that people are working with and looking at different ways to solve problems in the travel industry. And so I expect that to come back up, call it another bubble or just another wave. So it's really interesting to look at this slowing of activity that we've seen versus the amount of money that has gone into these companies. It's really grown exponentially over the years. And really interesting to note that, so just since 2015, there's been $19.8 billion pouring into travel startups, which is exciting, but as we'll see, it doesn't really tell the full story. As this disparity in the chart kind of indicates, that money is flowing into a smaller amount of companies. We look at the top 10 most funded travel startups over this period. It's kind of startling how much money Uber has raised and the anti-Uber alliance. The companies in blue here are ground transportation. Companies in green are lodging. So you have 68% of just really ride-sharing and private accommodations companies having raised 68% of the total funding. And across those other categories I talked about, it only leaves 32% share for those companies. And looking at some of these verticals more closely, ground transportation, we're looking here at the share of companies in blue and the share of funding in each category in green. So ground transportation, no surprise, we see almost half the funding there. Private accommodations, a lot of activity, a lot of funding. Lodging, air, and packaging and tours are stalwart categories of the travel industry. I think the new numbers that we'll have will show a lot more activity in corporate. There's definitely a lot of activity there I'm not sure we've captured yet. And events activities is an interesting one because you see a lot of companies founded there relative to a relatively low share of funding that's gone into that sector. And we anticipate that to come up, but it is true at the moment. There's a lot of companies there and not so much funding flowing in. And cruise, another top category where there is a lot of founding activity, but relatively little money flowing in there. So where are the rest of the companies? As you've heard a little bit here today, a lot of them are in the failed category, essentially. And a lot of those are itinerary, inspiration, destination content, and local, hyper-local, as we call it, with failure rates of around 40%, more than double of many of the rest of the categories. So these are just the hard stats, and I appreciate being here today to talk to many early stage entrepreneurs, because this is the kind of information we at least want you to know, what you're getting yourself into when you're approaching problems in one category versus another. And the stats for those companies, Itinerary, Inspiration, et cetera, just not good. But it's a very common problem for people to want to tackle. That travel planning is, like Julian mentioned, we always hear that stat, 38 sites that people visit, widely cited as a reason to start a travel startup. And that it's difficult to assemble all the information and get all your friends or family on the same page and create the perfect plan for everyone. And it's also kind of easy to start a planning startup. You basically need some data from an API and a good UX, and a good UX can go a long way, but you have a lot of competition. A lot of people have tried this because the bar is low there. But our own data, this is from the US Travel Technology Survey that we did in 2016, shows quite clearly when we ask people, are you frustrated with planning travel online, over 60% say no. And you have 30% saying yes, and it is certainly frustrating. You don't want to burn hours and hours of time planning. There's probably a better way, but it just doesn't really make for a good business anyway. So to contrast that, where the money flows in when we look at horizontal categories is into the booking category. And you think about that, that's where the money is, that's where the transaction is. That's where investors see the potential to build a profitable company and where they wind up investing. Mobile's really no surprise. I'll just skip that one. I mean, a lot of money flowing into mobile companies, of course. Peer-to-peer is, I would say, companies and investors chasing Airbnb and Uber models in particular, and a lot of meet a local type of startups, which we've seen a lot of. Search, of course, popular category. Data analytics and SaaS, I think, is another area where when I have the new numbers, we'll see those come up a lot. A lot of activity in that space. And social networking and UGC, again, showing the contrast between a lot of companies started there and not a lot of money flowing in because just generally viewed as so tough to run a good business there, a solid business. And same with content, just very difficult spaces to compete in. So getting into some geographic stats, we see the US, China, and India and Europe really commanding share of companies that have been founded. A lot of founding activity there, ton of money, China in particular, US of course. And it's interesting where that leaves the rest of the world here with a lot of companies, almost a third companies are started in other places, but only 3% of funding having gone there. So maybe good news for you here in San Francisco. But actually, the bad news is when we look at the shift of funding from 2005 to 9 to just the last couple of years, it's really startling to see the share that has shifted from the US to APAC and China in particular. So you guys have your work cut out for you, but that's why we're here, right? I don't have the silver bullet or the next big idea. That's really up for everyone here to figure out what that is. What are the next great businesses? But I would encourage you to look at how to apply new technologies that everybody here is thinking about to real problems in the travel industry. Not to try things that have been done, which again includes travel planning and search and booking. I mean, you have to come up with a very unique value proposition these days to be taken seriously and get considered for funding. And as Julian and Adam spelled out pretty clearly, there's a lot more that goes into it. But your head, if you're thinking about what's the future and you're riding waves that are rising and not sinking, and really capitalizing on trends and getting in early and really putting in years. It takes a long time to understand a market. I encourage people to try to work in an area, if that's building solutions for hotels or if it is a booking solution or a search solution, try to work for these companies and really understand where the gaps are, what the pain points are, and figure out how to address those. So this is really just a quick snapshot. I'll be presenting a lot more data at our Battleground event in September. Just did want to mention applications are open if you want to apply to pitch. Tickets are currently $149. They go to $199 on June 1st, but you can use the code TRAVELTECH17 to get $25 off anytime. We have Sam Shank keynoting, so there'll be a panel discussion as well, and I'll be presenting more data. There'll be networking, so it's a mini conference. And just to contrast the value here, the main conference in November, the full price ticket is $4,200. So it's always been kind of off limits for entrepreneurs. And Focusrite is really making an effort to figure out how to get more people into the ecosystem and make it more accessible. So this is our first real shot at doing that. And I hope to see you there. I hope this was helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike.
Hello?
Hello? Thank you, Mike. We have some time for a few questions, and just raise your hand and we'll give the mic to you. Anyone? Okay.
What's the next category to start travel strategy most ripe for disruption?
It's the $1 million question, for sure. I mean, that's why I put some of the technologies, which I don't even need to put up there. Everybody's familiar. But again, it's for you to figure out where those opportunities lie in the industry. Voice search, can you build a better search experience? Voice in the hotel room, for guest engagement. There are plenty of ways to think about it. So I want you to tell me at some point.
What are the biggest mistakes you see travel startups make again and again as they try to kind of grow in the industry?
Julian and Adam covered them pretty well. Validating the problem, that it really exists and that there is a business to be built there. Talking to your customers and really getting to know the opportunity and getting people, figuring out, will people really give you their credit card? I worked for Dreamit, an accelerator, and they often recommended build a landing page and drive some Google AdWords to that page. Just spend a few dollars trying to convince somebody to take action. Put your value proposition there, and can you get them to submit the form? Put a fake credit card. You don't even collect any information, but try to validate in any way that you can that problem exists. And you got to build a great team around you. I've talked about this a little bit the other day. A team that's really closely knit, very focused on a problem, ideally working in person. Having business and technical skills. Industry knowledge is not required. A lot of the companies that have succeeded, people didn't have industry backgrounds, but I think it certainly helps. So, come to conferences like this and network and try to assemble a great team around you.
Focusrite recently published some interesting research on local tour and activity booking activities. My question is around how that segment of the market, the in-destination travel, how you guys see that performing in a potential recession down the road. There's an argument to be made that travel isn't binary, so instead of going to Paris, you still go to Hilton Head and that market still succeeds. Is there anything in your research to support or refute that kind of analysis?
To my knowledge, we didn't look at that specifically, but that makes sense to me that you think of tours and activities as a travel vertical, perhaps, or we do primarily, but there's the local component too, to whatever degree people want to discover things going on around them or more close by. It's a difficult market because suppliers are so not tech savvy. And it's really hard to get a lot of suppliers to bring unique inventory online over time and then distribute that inventory in a meaningful way. But it's happening. I think it's going to take more time. And hopefully we'll see a lot more unique experiences being easily discoverable and accessible by travelers or locals.
Hi, Mike. I know you've talked to many, many startups over the last few years, and I was wondering if you could talk about some of the most exciting kind of combinations of those technologies you just put up in the list and markets, just to give us some ideas of what's working well, both in terms of execution and also in terms of strategy.
I don't like to choose favorites. So I usually just talk about the companies that have done well at Focusrite. So last week at our Europe, was it last week? Yeah. We at our Europe conference, at our Battleground, the winner was Kenichi, who is using mobile and AI. I think I know Norm probably knows them better than I do. But to create a link between TMCs and I guess specific hotel properties to create a really seamless experience for the business travelers who use that TMC. So really having preferred hotels and being able to travel very seamlessly, seamless check-in and check-out, personalization, all the amenities are there for them when they get there. So I thought that was a perfect example of really understanding the market, the traveler, and creating a solution that has a good business model. I think they were charging both sides, TMCs and travel and the hotel.
Well, it's interesting. They actually pivoted. So their whole goal. Thanks, Mike.
Sure.
They actually pivoted. So they began with kind of a hotel target, and they realized after they actually won the BTN Innovate Award, which is a sister publication for the corporate travel community. They won that award last year, and they realized the opportunity was really in the managed travel space. So rather than trying to sell hotels, they sold corporations who then pressured their hotels to install things like beacons. And what the end result really is, and I think this is a theme that Mike was saying, is reducing friction for the traveler. If you can reduce friction for the traveler, you may have something there, because there's a lot of friction in traveling. And the managed traveler programs are where the most frequent travelers are, or managed and unmanaged. A business traveler experience is an opportunity to explore.
Thanks, Norm. Other questions? All right, thank you.
One more. Yes, I'm going to change the clicker real quick. The other one for some reason doesn't work. Thank you very much for waiting. I just wanted to announce that we have a last-minute change in schedule today because of a family emergency of the CEO of Mezi, who was supposed to give a keynote today. But Mike, thank you very much for giving the surprise presentation, and we kind of kept it until the last moment. But I would like to announce Tony Perry from Deem, and welcome.
Thank you very much. Great. Thanks for having me. So, I'm Tani Perry. Oh, did we lose my... It's getting there. Yeah. Come on. So I'm Tani Perry, the VP of Marketing with Deem, and I come to you from the land down under. Luckily, this deck actually works. So I first came to the US 15 years ago, and I arrived in Aspen, Colorado, the land of the rich and famous. It was a great lifestyle. I got to ski in the winter, hike in the summer, and I worked with the Aspen Skiing Company and also with the Senres as the Director of Marketing and Technology. But I ultimately decided that I wanted to pursue a serious career in travel. And where else to do that but New York City, where I did this every morning for my commute. So I worked with North Star Travel Group for a series of brands there, including Focusrite, which I don't have to tell you about them. You just heard from Mike. Business Travel News, which is focused on the corporate market. Travel Weekly, which is geared to travel agents, and Web and Travel, a Singapore brand, among others. And now I work for Deem, a travel startup in the corporate space, although that's a longer story that I'll talk about a little bit later. So my topic today is, are travel startups still relevant? Yes, and you're crazy, I mean passionate if you start one. So I'm at a bit of a disadvantage here. One, I'm between you and lunch, and I know you're all hungry, so I'll try and keep this interactive. And second, I've actually sourced a lot of my data from Focusrite. So some of these charts are going to look really familiar. I didn't actually know Mike was presenting before me, so Max threw that in at the last minute. But as the industry maxim goes, repetition is always good, so you'll be seeing this twice. And also, I think too, Adam and Julian have said some very similar things about travel startups. So I apologize if any of this is unoriginal. So let's get into it. I have a question for the audience. I was actually going to ask how many travel startup founders and co-founders are here, but I already know that because Adam already asked that question. So I'll ask a regional question. Hands up, how many people are based in the US or starting something in the US? Okay, most of you. How about in Europe? 1, 2, 3. And what about Asia? One person? 2. Okay. All right. So very 3. Small number. Okay. So as you know, we've already looked at this. The travel market is huge. This is actually data from the US Travel Association, not Focusrite. The US spend reached $2.3 trillion last year. It raised $51.4 billion in taxes and generated 2.6 million in jobs. And I think Julian iterated this point. It really is a big market, and there's a lot of money here. In the last decade, 1,200 startups raised 32 billion. And this is a chart that CB Insights released last week. And what this looks at is global travel tech by quarter from 2012 through, I think, the second quarter in 17. And you can see the high point in 2015. There was healthy funding in 16, and already in 2017, it's looking good with more than $1 billion already raised. This is a look at investors who are in the travel space. Hands up who sees their logo on this chart. Anyone? Oh, we got a couple in the back there. Okay, so some of these logos probably look very familiar. You've already seen this, I don't need to reiterate it, but again, the high point here between 2011 and 2013, seen a little bit of a dip. And meanwhile, the unicorn list is growing, companies valued at $1 billion or more. At the top of the list, you see Uber at 69 billion, and all the way down to the bottom with BlaBlaCar, a French company in the ground transportation space, at 1.2 billion. Interestingly, a lot of these companies are based in Asia, or more than half. Didi, Yuka, Grab Taxi, Ola, Yida and Tujia, and Skyscanner really now being acquired by Ctrip. So if we look at this funding year over year, starting in 2011, at the low point, Airbnb raised 120 million. In 2012, we saw a bit of a bump to 207 million with an Airbnb funding round. Trivago all the way to 632. 2014, we broke the $1 billion mark. Uber raised 2.4 billion, and then in 2015, 4.9 billion. This is crazy money. 9 out of 10 of the most funded are in 2 verticals: ground transportation with Uber, Grab, Lyft, and then private accommodations, Airbnb, HomeAway. There's probably no surprises here. I think you've been hearing this over and over again. You're probably so bored of this point. It really does feel like this is the $1 billion takeover. The unicorns are sucking up all the oxygen in the industry. Still feeling brave? All passionate? There's good news for the rest of us. So excluding outliers, investment is still growing. If you look at this chart, again from Focusrite, thank you, from 2005 through 2015-16, you've seen a steady increase in the amount of funding that's out there. Travel startups are emerging in 3 categories. The US with 37% of the share, and then APAC 28, followed very closely by Europe with 27. But surprisingly, 90% of the funds are in the US and Asia markets. Europe is really struggling here. So for those few people that put your hands up, sorry, it's not a good situation for you right now. I was going to ask a question, and I don't have my notes. Oh, OK. Who is working at a ground transportation company or startup? 1. How about private accommodations? Anybody? No. What about destination content? I've got a couple more. Okay. So not many of you actually, but these are the three most popular categories among entrepreneurs, starting with private accommodation, ground transportation, and destination content. In terms of funding though, you'll see that ground transportation and private accommodation have captured most of this. But again, Mike went over this, we don't need to talk about it again. What about people who are doing something in the events and activity space? Just one? Okay. Oh, a couple. All right, so again, this chart for the third time today. You're seeing that 13% of entrepreneurs, the share is in this field. So it's a really hot market, although not as much funding. But there is a lot of movement, I think, in the last couple of weeks. There's a couple of companies that have raised, and it's in my notes, and I don't have access to them, so I can't tell you what it is. But you can ask me afterwards. As said by Miriam Moscovici of BCD Travel, this shit is hard. According to Bain Research, 1 in 500 will only ever reach the $100 million mark, and even fewer reach 500 million and maintain sustainable growth. 1 in 17,000. Those are astronomical odds. This is a chart from Crunchbase that shows the US startup survival curve from 2003 until 2013. It's a pretty steep decline. Doesn't look great. The failure rate of travel startups in the itinerary, inspiration, and destination content categories tops 40%. That's really high. And according to CB Insights, in the last 15 years, 52% of Fortune 500 companies have disappeared. So this is really hard stuff, even for established companies, not just travel startups. So if travel is in such a dire situation, where's the innovation? Well, if we look at the Forbes top innovation list from last year, half of the companies are in biotech, and there's not a single travel company on this list. It looks a little better if we look at the Fast Company list that came out earlier this year. Uber's at number 3, Airbnb at 17, and Marriott at 39, but that's only 3 out of 50. It's a really sad story. Your company belongs here. You guys are the innovators. We need to see more travel in these kinds of lists. According to Douglas Quinby, the Senior Vice President of Research at Focusrite, as if you haven't heard from enough Focusrite people today, there's so much opportunity for technology to solve travel crappiness, and who else is going to do that but travel startups? Okay, so I've painted a pretty dire picture here, but you're still brave and you're still passionate. How do you avoid imminent death? So I spoke to a lot of industry people over the last 4 weeks, just trying to get a sense of what kinds of things travel startups could do to survive in this really turmoil. And I heard the same kind of advice over and over again. So Steve Blank, who is the father of the lean startup movement, says, startups don't fail because they lack a product. They fail because they lack a customer and a profitable business model. So my advice point number 1 is solve real problems. And Julian stole my thunder by already telling you about this research from Expedia Media Solutions. But travelers visit 38 sites to plan their leisure trips. And as you already know, this isn't a valid problem to solve. People love visiting 38 sites. They only take 1 or 2 leisure trips per year, and they really want to dedicate all that time to finding and being inspired and planning all the bits and pieces of their trip. So this isn't a real problem, probably never will be. Rod Cuthbert, the CEO of Rome to Rio, says, look for a niche no one else has covered, do your research, and then test obsessively. To tell you a personal story, so Deem is in the corporate travel industry. We provide online booking tools and car service, expense management. We are a 15-year-old company. We raised originally $500 million. Think about that for a second. That's $500 million. And we were in everything from flower delivery, shipping, loyalty, procurement. I mean, we had so many different product lines, we weren't really sure what we did. And so we didn't have any focus, we weren't solving any real problems, and that's not the right way to go about it. So we reset the company in April of last year. We raised a new round of funding, and we've refocused on travel, car service, and expense. We think we finally found the real problem to solve. And we're gaining traction and things are looking up. So if I'm back here next year, I can let you know how it's going. All right, advice point number 2, follow the money. According to Gadi Bashvitz, the founder of Allset, who's actually now a part of the Deem team after we acquired his company last year, says, if you don't understand the flow of revenue, you will never capture any for yourself. Focusrite again. So if you look at this chart, this is US travel market year-over-year channel change from 2014 with predictions through to 2020. So why this is important to you is you have to look at the shift of revenue, where the money is going. If you work at an OTA or you partner with them, it's good to know that they had a high point in 2016, but they're seeing decline in their share now. Alternately, if you work for a TMC or you're in Senres, then you were having a really tough time in 2016, but things are finally starting to look up through 2018. So it's important to look at research like this and really understand where the money is flowing, because it will tell you where you should go. I think Adam made a very clear point about the fact that if you are not making money or you don't know where the money is, you're not going to last. According to Bobby Healy, the CTO of CarTrawler, I wouldn't start a company in travel now. It's too expensive to acquire customers, and there's always someone who's better funded. Don't go after these guys. I think Julian already said it as well. These guys have so much cash, they're spending more than $10 billion on advertising. This is the number from 2016. If you were trying to acquire customers through Google search or some other form of advertising, you need really, really deep pockets. Instead, what you should be doing is focusing here, filling the gaps in the ecosystem. Companies like Uber and Airbnb, for example, have created a whole new set of real problems for you to solve. So go here. It's going to be much easier. Okay, point number 3. If you need to pivot, pivot fast. And I think this is a really obvious point, but one that bears repeating. According to Vijay Govindarajan, the author of The 3-Box Solution and How to Lead Innovation, past success can trap companies into believing what they have done is a blueprint for what they should do. You guys are not stuck with legacy processes or an entrenched product that you need to protect for revenue. If you found that if you aren't solving a real problem or you haven't understood where the revenue is flowing, you can change quickly, and that's what you should be doing. Let's take a couple of examples. I know Julian mentioned Lola, but to give you a little bit more detail on that, Lola was co-founded by Paul English, or was founded by Paul English, the co-founder of Kayak. Last year, he raised $43 million, and she's right, he's probably spent most of it, to offer AI and human combined travel assistance. They originally pitched this towards consumers, and they realized that wasn't working. Again, consumers don't travel that often. So last week, they announced a pivot. They're switching to the corporate market, and I think we're going to hear that a lot. Mike just mentioned another example. Corporate travel, if you think back to that chart where it showed failure rate, corporate failure rates are at 7%, which is quite low. So that's a hint for all of you guys in here. If you need to pivot, corporate travel is where it's at. Another example is Hopper. They originally launched in 2004. They were originally a search-based trip planning, and they realized that didn't work. Google already had that covered. So they reset the company in 2014 with new funding, and they released a mobile-only flight search. It tells you the best time to fly to the best destination for the best price. They went from 1 million to 10 million downloads last year, and they're on schedule, I think, to reach 50 million by the end of this year. So a fairly successful pivot. All right, number 4, pick your timing. So Bill Gross is a serial entrepreneur and a TED Talk speaker. He says that timing is everything. It's more important than any of the other factors on this chart. If you have the right timing, you are more likely to see than if you have a bucket load of funding. So that should be encouraging in light of the funding that's being taken by a lot of the unicorns. Team execution is the second most likely factor for your success, followed by the actual idea. Adam talked a lot about how you should push the product lower, and I think this research supports that idea. Your timing is really important, but the product comes in third. Take, for example, this Friendster versus Facebook. So Friendster launched in 2002, raised 22 million, and then shut its doors in 2015. Does anyone remember Friendster? Oh yeah, we've got a couple. All right, so Facebook launched in 2008, and its market cap is now $430 billion. So very stark contrast. I know that timing wasn't the only factor in the outcome of both of these companies, but it probably had a lot to do with it. If we look at an example in travel, is there anyone here from Couchsurfing? Okay, good. Because Couchsurfing launched in 2002 and has been limping along ever since. Skift actually released an article a few weeks ago saying they might as well close because they're never going to amount to anything. Pretty harsh, but might be true. If you compare that to Airbnb, again, slightly different model, but Airbnb launched in 2008 and is now worth $3.9 billion. So dramatically different outcomes for both of those companies. All right, and finally, number 5, stay crazy. I mean passionate. Ellen Kessler with Clear Sky Associates, and also someone who's spent a lot of time in the travel industry, who talks to a lot of innovators, told me the well-established companies aren't always innovative, and that leaves an opening for startups. I'll leave you with this parting thought from one of my favorite authors. You're off to great places. Today is your day. Your mountain is waiting, so get on your way. Thank you. I think we have time for questions because that was really fast. Or we can just go to lunch. Up to you guys. Max, I think they're hungry. Max, are you in the room? All right, I guess thank you, everybody. If there's an announcement for lunch. Do we have any questions? I don't think we did. Sorry.
Okay. Thank you for listening, ladies and
All right,
gentlemen.
thanks.